The hour was 6:30, the morning of June 6, 1944. A young man, barely 20 years old, stood hunched within a concrete emplacement, its embrasure framing a stretch of shoreline that would soon bear the Allied codename Omaha. He was a farmer's son from the lowlands of Saxony, and until this moment, he had never aimed his weapon at another soul. What the next 9 hours would demand of him defied all previous understanding. This firing post, designated Widerstandsness 62, constituted one node in a network of 15 such strongpoints along that segment of the Atlantic defenses. He had been assigned here 3 months prior, contributing to the arduous labor of digging trenches, unspooling barbed wire, and sighting the heavy machine guns now trained on the churning waters of the English Channel. Every undulation of the beach below was familiar to him. He knew precisely where the tide would turn, where the soft sand gave way to rock, and the exact spots where advancing troops, denied cover, would inevitably bunch together, becoming easy targets for the pre-sighted killing zones his commanders had so meticulously marked. Through the pre-dawn mist, a terrifying panorama began to unfold. The horizon filled first with a scattering of ships, then hundreds, and finally, thousands. He had been assured the Atlantic Wall was an unbreachable barrier. He had been told the Americans were soft, undisciplined, incapable of sustained warfare. He had been told many things that morning. His immediate superior had reiterated the previous night that any invasion must be crushed on the beaches themselves, not permitted to reach the hedgerows or villages further inland. Field Marshal Rommel himself had declared that the first 24 hours would seal Germany's fate. A foothold for the enemy meant the war was lost. Yet, none of these pronouncements prepared him for the reality that surged forward. What this young soldier witnessed that morning, and what he would spend the remainder of his life attempting to reconcile, marked the inception of a profound change in how German troops perceive their American adversaries. This shift would transform a deeply ingrained disdain into bewildering confusion, that confusion into a grudging respect, and ultimately, that respect into something akin to fear. This account does not primarily concern itself with battles won or lost, but rather with the reshaping of perception, the story of how an entire army, steeped in professional tradition, was compelled to reevaluate every assumption about the men they faced. This narrative begins not on the landing beaches of Normandy, but amidst the sun-baked plains of North Africa, a full 18 months earlier. By February of 1943, the men of the Africa Corps carried every reason for their self-assurance. These were seasoned veterans, tempered by 2 years of relentless campaigning against British forces across the vast expanses of Libya and Egypt. They had served under the command of Rommel, the celebrated Desert Fox, and they understood how to secure victory. These soldiers had endured the scorching crucible of desert combat, learning to fight through sandstorms that obliterated all visibility and mastering the intricate dance of tank warfare across open terrain where a single misstep meant oblivion. They had clashed with British Commonwealth units at Tobruk and El Alamein, pushing relentlessly to within 60 miles of the Suez Canal. They regarded themselves, with considerable justification, as among the finest fighting forces in the world. Thus, when intelligence arrived in November 1942, reporting that American forces had disembarked in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch, the initial German reaction spanned from light amusement to outright scorn. One junior corporal, serving with the 15th Panzer Division, encapsulated this prevalent sentiment in a letter home written in mid-February 1943. He wrote of encountering the Amos, their derogatory term for the Americans, just days before, describing how they had destroyed more than 90 enemy tanks. He confidently predicted they would crush him and all his rabble. This attitude was not simply the arrogance born of consistent triumph. It was anchored in long-held convictions regarding American society itself. German propaganda had spent years painting the United States as a morally bankrupt nation, consumed by material wealth, debilitated by racial mixing, and fundamentally incapable of producing effective soldiers. The pervasive belief within the Wehrmacht was that Americans were mere amateurs playing at war, while German professionals conducted the true fighting. The early days of the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 appeared to validate every German expectation. Rommel's combat groups tore through inexperienced American formations, inflicting devastating losses. Over 6,000 casualties, including some 300 dead, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 captured. American tanks burned skeletal husks against the Tunisian hills. Their infantry units dissolved in disarray. American field commanders struggled to regain control of their scattered units. The deficiencies within the American forces were indeed extensive. Units were spread thinly across vast sectors, lacking adequate communication and mutual support. Some replacement soldiers had reached the front lines only days before the fighting, many having never completed basic training. One American regiment, for instance, received its first consignment of bazookas on February 12th, only to be forced to learn their operation against actual German armor 2 days later. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding the American II Corps, had deployed his forces in a manner that invited disaster. His units were dispersed across a 30-mile front, task forces fragmented and unable to lend support to one another. When the German assault commenced, American formations were systematically dismantled, piece by piece. German tank crews described the fighting in Tunisia with an almost giddy satisfaction. After years of confronting the meticulous and well-supplied British, they found American units disorganized and prone to panic. Their panzers rolled through positions that should have been impregnable. Infantry scattered under German pressure. Officers lost contact with their subordinates. Rommel himself initially echoed his troops' dismissive appraisal. He had meticulously studied the American positions, observed the scattered disposition of their forces, and pinpointed what he termed fundamental weaknesses in their tactical thinking. The Americans, he concluded, were years away from achieving military competence. Yet, during those 5 days at Kasserine, something transpired that Rommel had not anticipated. Something that planted the first flicker of uncertainty in German minds regarding their confident assessment of American fighting capacity. By the 4th day of the engagement, American resistance unexpectedly hardened. Artillery fire, which had been sporadic and poorly coordinated at the battle's outset, suddenly became devastatingly accurate. Infantry units that had initially fractured under the initial onslaught reformed their lines and launched counterattacks. The withdrawal that Rommel had fully expected to degenerate into a headlong rout instead transformed into an organized fighting retreat. By February 22nd, Rommel issued an order that surprised even his own staff. He commanded a withdrawal, not because his forces had been decisively defeated, but because the Americans were no longer behaving like the vanquished enemy he had so confidently anticipated. In his private dispatches, Rommel later recorded a revised evaluation. He wrote that the enemy's defensive conduct had been first class, noting their remarkably swift recovery after the initial shock and their success in stemming the German advance. That precise phrasing, recovered very quickly, would recur constantly in German assessments of American forces for the remainder of the conflict. The Germans had expected the Americans to shatter. Instead, they bent under the pressure and sprang back. What Rommel and his officers could not discern was the vast machinery of transformation already churning into motion behind the American lines. Within weeks of the Kasserine debacle, commanders were swiftly replaced. General Fredendall was relieved of his post and replaced by George S. Patton, a leader of an entirely different caliber. Omar Bradley was brought in as the assistant corps commander. The entire command structure underwent a sweeping reorganization. More crucially, the American Army itself learned. Officers who had borne witness to the disaster meticulously analyzed what had gone wrong and swiftly implemented corrective measures. Dispersed units were consolidated. Training programs were dramatically intensified. Communication protocols were thoroughly overhauled. The coordination of artillery, previously inconsistent at best, became an immediate priority. The sheer speed of this adaptation astonished German commanders, who had expected the Americans to require many months, even years, to assimilate their hard-won lessons. Instead, tangible improvements became evident within mere weeks. At the Battle of El Getter in late March 1943, a mere 5 weeks after Kasserine, American forces confronted another German assault. This time they held their ground. American artillery shattered German armored columns. Infantry stood firm. The Germans withdrew, having achieved nothing. This recurring pattern of rapid learning would come to define the American military experience throughout the Second World War. Unlike armies built upon centuries of tradition and rigid doctrines, the Americans demonstrated a striking willingness to discard ineffective methods and swiftly adopt new ones. They assimilated lessons from their British allies, from their German adversaries, and most importantly, they learned from their own mistakes, and they learned with astonishing rapidity. The German army in Tunisia ultimately found itself caught in an inescapable vice, squeezed between American forces advancing from the west and British units pressing from the east. On May 13, 1943, the tattered remnants of the Afrika Korps surrendered, along with over 260,000 Axis troops. It was a catastrophic defeat for Germany, second in magnitude only to the disaster at Stalingrad. Among those captured were many of the same battle-hardened veterans who had so casually mocked American soldiers just 3 months prior. However, the full implications of this shift in the balance of power would not become truly clear until the summer of 1944, until Normandy, until men like the young soldier on Omaha Beach witnessed firsthand what American industrial might and sheer determination could truly accomplish. The morning of June 6, 1944, irrevocably altered every German soldier's understanding of fighting Americans. The young machine gunner remained stationed in Widerstandsness 62, a fortified strongpoint positioned to overlook the sector the Allies now knew as Omaha Beach. He manned his MG-42, its muzzle commanding a clear field of fire across several hundred meters of exposed sand. Far below him, the initial waves of American infantry would be forced across this open killing ground, directly beneath the devastating hail of his weapon. As the landing craft emerged through the dense morning fog, he began to fire, and he did not cease for hours. The weapon in his hands, an MG-42, was widely considered one of the most efficient machine guns of the conflict. It delivered a staggering 1,200 rounds per minute, a rate of fire so intense that individual shots merged into a continuous, deafening roar. Below, American soldiers were forced to traverse hundreds of meters of open beach, utterly exposed to this relentless barrage. There was no meaningful cover, no concealment to be found, only sand, water, and the protracted agony of men with nowhere left to hide. He later estimated that he expended over 12,000 rounds that morning. He cycled through several barrels as they became dangerously overheated. He fired until his hands were raw with blisters, until his ears rang with a persistent metallic clang, and until the acrid stench of burnt propellant permeated the confines of his bunker. He fired until his machine gun ammunition was exhausted, at which point he switched to a rifle. He continued to fire until American forces finally breached the beach defenses, compelling his reluctant withdrawal. The events of that beach have been recounted in innumerable historical texts, yet the German perspective often illuminates details quite distinct from the American narratives of heroism and sacrifice. From his fortified position behind the machine gun, the young soldier watched wave after wave of American troops fall. He watched as they accumulated at the water's edge. He watched the incoming tide inexorably carry the bodies away. And he watched something else, something deeply unsettling. He watched them continue to advance. This was the specific detail that German soldiers across the entire Normandy front reported with a mixture of disbelief and growing horror. The Americans simply did not halt. Landing craft were obliterated, yet more appeared to take their place. Men were cut down on the sand, and still others ran forward to fill the gaps. Entire units were decimated, only for fresh formations to land and persist with the assault. A German wireless operator, assigned to an adjacent bunker near the young machine gunner's position, later described his experience from that morning. He recalled that on the night of June 5th, with a strong wind and thick cloud cover. None of them had anticipated an invasion. But then, in the night, the air became thick with the drone of countless aircraft. Were they demolishing tonight, he wondered. Soon, however, the reports began to cascade. Parachutists here, gliders there. Finally, landing craft approaching. By morning, a colossal naval force was sighted. That was the final report the forward observation posts could relay before being overrun. And it was the last coherent information they received about the unfolding situation. It became impossible to gain any accurate understanding of events. Wireless communications were jammed, cables severed, officers completely lost their grasp of the battle. When this soldier was eventually captured and confronted with the sheer scale of the Allied assembly, his reaction encapsulated the feelings of many Germans. He admitted he was initially depressed, an old soldier taken prisoner within hours of the invasion start. But upon seeing the vast quantities of material behind the enemy lines, he realized, "Old man, how lucky you have been." A German officer from the 352nd Infantry Division, defending the sector adjacent to the young machine gunner's position, later articulated the profound psychological impact. He recounted being told the Americans were poor soldiers, that they would not fight. But they came across that beach into our guns, he stated. They kept coming. We killed them, and still they came. No soldier who experienced this could maintain contempt for such an enemy. The sheer physical magnitude of the invasion compounded this psychological shock. German defenders peered out across the English Channel and beheld an armada that defied all comprehension. One captured German soldier, being marched past supply dumps established on the beach within hours of the landings, famously remarked, "I know how you defeated us. You piled up the supplies and then let them fall on us." He was more profoundly correct than he could have realized. The conflict in Europe became what the Germans termed a Materialschlacht, a battle of sheer material, and the Americans waged this battle on a scale the Germans could scarcely begin to imagine. Within 48 hours of the initial landings, more than 130,000 troops had disembarked. Within a week, that number swelled to over 300,000. The Allies had constructed artificial harbors from prefabricated components, towing them across the Channel and establishing a port where no natural harbor existed. German officers, who had previously studied the logistical impossibility of sustaining an invasion force across open beaches, now watched the impossible unfold before their very eyes. These artificial harbors, christened mulberries, were engineering marvels. The Allies deliberately scuttled old ships to create essential breakwaters. They floated colossal concrete caissons across the Channel. They assembled pontoon bridges and piers designed to rise and fall with the shifting tides. A fully functional port materialized on the French coast in a matter of days. German officers, seasoned by campaigns from France to North Africa and the Soviet Union, who understood the logistical nightmares that had doomed Germany's proposed Operation Sea Lion invasion of Britain, now witnessed this spectacle and realized they were confronting something entirely unprecedented. They were left to ponder. Were you fighting? How can you possibly win? There was no more hope of stemming this Allied advance than there was of controlling the weather itself. What was arriving was not merely an army, but an inexorable force of nature. Where no port had existed to launch such an assault, the Allies simply built one from concrete and steel. The contrast with German logistics was stark and demoralizing. The Wehrmacht remained heavily reliant on horses for transportation. Their motor pool was a chaotic patchwork of German, Italian, captured French, and British vehicles, each demanding different spare parts that were perpetually unavailable. German soldiers frequently went hungry, while the Americans appeared to possess an endless abundance of food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment. To capture an American supply depot was like unearthing a treasure trove. German soldiers who overran American positions were astounded by the sheer quantity of provisions. Everything a fighting man might need was meticulously organized and readily accessible. Rations that included chocolate and cigarettes, comprehensive medical supplies, spare parts for every imaginable piece of equipment, and fuel. The crushing contrast with their own scarcity profoundly eroded German morale. The German experience at Normandy compelled a fundamental reassessment of American military capabilities. However, it was not merely the sheer volume of material that impressed German soldiers. It was also the manner in which the Americans fought once they had established their foothold beyond the beaches. In the dense hedgerow country of Normandy, American infantry tactics evolved with an alarming speed that deeply concerned German commanders. Units that had performed inadequately in the initial days adapted their methodologies within weeks. They devised novel techniques for breaching the thick bocage hedgerows. They seamlessly integrated tanks, infantry, and engineers into cohesive combined arms teams. They learned to call in devastating artillery and close air support with remarkable precision and coordination. The bocage terrain was inherently perfect for defense. Centuries-old hedgerows, often sitting atop earthen embankments thick enough to halt a tank, divided the Norman countryside into thousands of small, enclosed fields. The vegetation was dense enough to perfectly conceal machine gun nests. Every single field became a potential killing ground. German forces exploited this terrain with expert precision. They had dug in, established interlocking fields of fire, and prepared to extract a heavy toll for every meter of ground the Americans sought to gain. In the initial days following the landings, this strategy proved effective. American units suffered heavy casualties attempting to push through the hedgerows using tactics designed for more open terrain. But then the Americans adapted. Someone, the exact origin remains debated, conceived the idea of welding steel teeth onto the front of their Sherman tanks. These improvised teeth, often fashioned from captured German beach obstacles, allowed the tanks to rip through the dense hedgerow embankments rather than attempting to climb over them, a maneuver that had exposed their vulnerable underbellies to German anti-tank weapons. Within weeks, thousands of American tanks had undergone this modification. Infantry tactics evolved in lockstep with the equipment. Small unit leaders rapidly developed new techniques for coordinated assaults on hedgerow positions. Artillery-forward observers perfected methods for calling in devastatingly accurate fire on concealed German strongpoints. Engineers blasted critical gaps for armor to exploit. Close air support pilots learned to operate closer to friendly troops without causing accidental casualties. The Germans observed this rapid evolution with growing alarm. They were accustomed to engaging enemies who required months to adjust their methods. The British, in particular, had often been slow to change. The Americans, however, adapted in a matter of days. Innovative ideas flowed upward from privates and sergeants to colonels and generals. Solutions that proved effective were immediately disseminated across units. The entire army seemed to learn and adapt as a single, responsive organism. Field Marshal Rommel, now commanding the German defense in Normandy, noted this relentless adaptation with profound apprehension. In a report dispatched to Berlin, he wrote of the enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery, and even more in the air, that has broken the front open. He further emphasized their great superiority in artillery and outstandingly large supply of ammunition. The American artillery system was unlike anything the Germans had previously encountered. It was not merely the sheer number of guns, though those numbers were indeed formidable. It was the sophisticated manner in which these weapons were employed. American fire direction centers possessed the capability to coordinate multiple batteries, orchestrating them to fire simultaneously on a single target in what were termed time-on-target missions. All the shells would arrive at the exact same moment, offering enemy soldiers no warning to seek cover. German veterans spoke of American artillery with something approaching awe. Its accuracy was stunning, its volume overwhelming, and it seemed to fall everywhere, all the time, without cessation. One German officer described lying trapped in a trench while American shells rained down for hours, utterly unable to move, unable to retaliate, simply waiting for the barrage to cease or for a single round to find him. The small Piper Cub observation aircraft utilized by American artillery battalions quickly became symbols of impending doom. German soldiers soon learned that if they spotted one of these diminutive planes circling overhead, their position had been compromised and artillery fire was imminent. The Germans referred to them as their most hated enemies, often fearing them more than tanks or infantry. Air power further amplified the American artillery advantage. American fighter-bombers roamed relentlessly behind German lines, striking at anything that dared to move. Truck convoys were decimated on the roads. Trains were strafed in their stations. Individual soldiers learned to freeze instantly at the distant drone of aircraft engines, knowing that even the slightest movement might draw a precision attack. German reinforcements attempting to reach the Normandy front were forced to travel exclusively at night and seek deep concealment during daylight hours. Units that should have arrived in a matter of hours often took days. Fuel and ammunition, vital for resupplying frontline troops, were frequently destroyed before ever reaching their destination. The Germans found themselves fighting with one hand tied behind their backs, while the Americans appeared to possess inexhaustible resources. However, what truly altered German perceptions was not merely the overwhelming American firepower. It was the distinct character of American aggression. German veterans who had fought against the British, the French, and the Soviets reported a unique quality in American combat behavior. One former Wehrmacht soldier, interviewed after the war, articulated it thus: "The British," he said, "were competent and professional, but slow. They would only attack with absolutely overwhelming force and methodical preparation. The Russians were capable soldiers, but their tactics were often crude, relying on sheer mass. The Americans were different. What most struck German soldiers was their immediate, relentless aggression. Where other allies might return fire and cautiously seek a more advantageous position, Americans would instantly respond, call down a punishing torrent of artillery or air power onto whatever they were fighting, and then move to counterattack as soon as the bombardment ended." German veterans described this combination of overwhelming firepower and unyielding forward momentum as unlike anything they had encountered on any other front. This aggressive approach repeatedly caught German forces off guard. They were accustomed to measured responses to enemies who would consolidate their gains before pressing further. The Americans, however, pressed forward immediately. They absorbed casualties that would have caused other armies to pause and regroup, yet they simply kept attacking. German veterans found this utterly unprecedented. While the British attacked methodically, with careful preparation, they typically halted to reorganize after achieving an objective. The Soviets attacked with immense mass and a disregard for casualties, but often lacked tactical finesse. The Americans seemed to combine the raw aggression of the Soviets with the meticulous organization of the British, and then added their own distinctive willingness to improvise on the fly. German veterans who endured the Normandy campaign consistently described American tactics as relentless. The tempo of operations never slackened. Before defenders could recover from one assault, another would strike from a different direction. Losses that would have stalled other forces seemed only to fuel American determination. The sheer effort required merely to survive against such constant pressure was exhausting. This unceasing operational tempo, maintained day after day and week after week, relentlessly wore down the German defenders. Units that had begun at full strength were ground down to mere shadows. Officers who had survived years of brutal fighting were killed or gravely wounded. The ceaseless pressure, combined with overwhelming firepower and an apparently endless stream of supplies, created conditions under which an effective defense became utterly impossible. Simultaneously, German soldiers noted a perplexing contradiction. These same ferociously aggressive fighters treated prisoners and civilians with a consideration that seemed utterly incompatible with their brutality in combat. German propaganda had diligently warned its soldiers to expect merciless treatment from the Americans. Instead, captured Germans frequently found themselves offered cigarettes, chocolate, and prompt medical attention. The stark contrast between their expectations and the reality they encountered left many prisoners stunned. They had been told Americans would be cruel and vindictive. Instead, they found captors who respected the Geneva Convention, provided essential medical care, and treated prisoners with a dignity that many had not anticipated from any enemy. German officers who became prisoners were particularly struck by the informal relationships between American officers and their enlisted men. The conspicuous absence of a rigid hierarchy astonished them. American officers ate with their men, joked with them, and interacted as colleagues rather than distant superiors. This informality, which traditional German military culture would have considered a grave weakness, paradoxically seemed to foster soldiers who fought with immense initiative and unwavering determination. This unsettling combination of combat ferocity and humane treatment created a profound cognitive dissonance for German soldiers. The enemy was simultaneously more aggressive in battle and more civilized in victory than their propaganda had ever prepared them for. The manufactured image of the soft, decadent American had collided head-on with reality, and reality had decisively triumphed. By December 1944, German forces in the West had been driven back to the very borders of the Reich. Hitler, desperate to reverse the tide of war, amassed his remaining reserves for one final, audacious offensive. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, would strike through the dense Ardennes forest, the very route German forces had utilized to sweep aside France in 1940. The ultimate objective was to cleave the Allied armies in two and seize the vital port of Antwerp. This engagement would become the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army, and it would deliver the conclusive evidence of how utterly German perceptions of American soldiers have been transformed. The offensive was a personal gamble for Hitler, made against the collective advice of his most seasoned generals. He had scraped together virtually every remaining reserve the Wehrmacht could muster. 3 armies, over 200,000 men, and nearly 1,000 tanks. The goal was breathtakingly audacious: to burst through the Ardennes, split the Allied forces, capture Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate for peace. German commanders harbored deep skepticism. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Walter Model both believed the plan was far too ambitious given the dwindling resources available. Model reportedly confided to his subordinates that the plan possessed no more than a 10% chance of success. But Hitler would brook no objections. The attack would proceed. On December 16, 1944, over 200,000 German troops, supported by almost 1,000 tanks, launched a sudden assault against American positions, which were thinly spread across an 85-mile front in the Ardennes. The timing had been meticulously chosen. Hitler had waited for weather conditions that would effectively ground Allied aircraft. Heavy fog and persistent snow blanketed the entire region, completely neutralizing the overwhelming air superiority that had devastated German forces in Normandy. The initial assault achieved complete tactical surprise. American units, many of them inexperienced replacements or exhausted from previous engagements, were rapidly overwhelmed. In some sectors, German forces advanced an astonishing 50 miles in the first few days alone. The element of surprise was absolute. Allied intelligence had inexplicably failed to detect the massive German buildup. Commanders, who should have been acutely aware of the possibility of such an attack, had instead convinced themselves the war was all but won. The Ardennes sector was widely considered a quiet area, a tranquil zone where weary divisions could rest and new ones could undergo training. Some American soldiers, lulled into complacency, referred to it as the Ghost Front. German forces exploited this complacency with ruthless efficiency. Specially trained commandos, infiltrating behind Allied lines in American uniforms, spread widespread confusion. They altered road signs, cut crucial communications wires, and disseminated false rumors. American security procedures dissolved into chaos as soldiers struggled to distinguish genuine Americans from German infiltrators, resorting to questions about baseball teams and state capitals. For a brief, terrifying moment, it appeared that the old German assessment might be tragically vindicated. American units fractured. Thousands surrendered. The most inexperienced American division, the 106th Infantry, suffered the loss of 2 entire regiments. Over 7,000 men, in one of the largest mass surrenders in American military history. But then, something quite distinct began to happen. Something that vividly crystallized everything German soldiers had learned about their adversary over the preceding 2 years. American forces at the critical crossroads town of Bastogne defiantly refused to retreat. Surrounded by German troops demanding their capitulation, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe dispatched a single-word reply: nuts. That one word conveyed a fundamental truth that the Germans had, through bitter experience, come to comprehend. The Americans would not break. They would not quit. They could be killed, but they could not be made to stop fighting. The defense of Bastogne became instantly legendary. The town commanded the junction of 7 vital roads, making its control absolutely essential for German logistics. Without Bastogne, the entire German offensive could not be sustained. So, the Germans demanded surrender, and the Americans refused. Inside the perimeter, conditions rapidly deteriorated. The 101st Airborne Division, which had been hastily rushed to Bastogne, was critically low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Wounded men lay in makeshift aid stations without adequate care. The weather was brutally cold, with temperatures well below freezing and snow falling relentlessly. German forces had completely encircled the town, yet the defenders held fast. When German attacks probed the perimeter, American paratroopers hurled them back. When ammunition dwindled, soldiers scavenged from the fallen and repurposed captured enemy weapons. When artillery support seemed utterly impossible due to the encirclement, forward observers miraculously found ways to call in fire from distant guns that should not have been able to reach. The defense was resourceful, fiercely determined, and utterly, implacably stubborn. On December 26th, elements of General George Patton's Third Army finally broke through to Bastogne. This relief force had traversed over 150 miles in harsh winter conditions, fighting through persistent German resistance every step of the way. This rapid movement, executed in a matter of days, was considered one of the most remarkable achievements of American logistics and leadership in the entire war. At the crucial road junction of St. Vith, American armored forces held out for 6 days against overwhelming odds, heroically buying precious time for Allied forces to organize a cohesive response. Small units of engineers and infantry valiantly delayed German spearheads by defending crossroads they had no realistic hope of holding. Soldiers purposefully burned or relocated critical gasoline stockpiles, preventing them from falling into the hands of German tanks that were now desperately short of fuel. The speed and precision with which American artillery responded to the offensive astonishingly bewildered German commanders. Units that had been in disarray just 48 hours earlier were suddenly delivering coordinated fire that systematically shattered German formations. At Elsenborn Ridge, in the northern sector of the Bulge, American forces amassed almost 350 guns and unleashed what German soldiers described as a wall of steel. The 6th SS Panzer Army, Hitler's elite formation, literally collided with this unyielding barrier. Their advance was stopped cold. When the oppressive weather finally cleared on December 23rd, American air power roared back into the battle. The impact was utterly devastating. German tanks, trucks, and troop columns that had been moving freely under the protective cloud cover were suddenly exposed to relentless aerial attack. Fuel supplies, already critically low, were destroyed on the roads. The offensive, which depended entirely on speed and momentum, ground to an agonizing halt. Fighter bombers appeared in relentless waves. P-47s, laden with bombs and rockets, savaged German armored columns. C-47 transport planes airdropped vital supplies to the besieged Bastogne defenders. Medium bombers pounded German supply depots and rail lines. The sky, which had provided crucial protection for the German advance for days, now became their most fearsome adversary. German soldiers who had experienced the full weight of Allied air power in Normandy immediately recognized the dire implications of this shift. The window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Without fuel, their tanks transformed into immobile steel coffins. Without ammunition, their artillery fell silent. Without supplies, their men starved and froze. The fuel shortage quickly became critical. German tanks, the very heart of the offensive, could no longer move. Some crews desperately drained fuel from one vehicle to enable another to advance a few more kilometers. Others simply abandoned their machines entirely, utterly unable to refuel them. The 116th Panzer Division, for example, reached the end of the battle without a single operational tank remaining, simply because there was no fuel to power them. By mid-January 1945, the Bulge had been entirely eliminated. German losses exceeded 100,000 killed, wounded, or missing. More significantly, the Wehrmacht had expended its last strategic reserves. There would be no further offensives, no more counterattacks. Only a continuous retreat remained. The human cost was staggering for both sides. American casualties surpassed 80,000, including over 19,000 killed. It was the costliest single battle in American history. However, while American losses could eventually be replaced, German losses could not. The men, the tanks, the fuel, the ammunition expended in the Ardennes represented resources that Germany could never possibly recover. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared the Battle of the Bulge undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. German soldiers who survived it, however, offered a very different kind of assessment. They had witnessed an army that could absorb a devastating surprise attack, stabilize its lines under immense pressure, and then counterattack with overwhelming force, all within the span of just a few weeks. When one German armored commander was asked for his current thoughts on the American soldier, his response was brief and resigned. "What is the point in this? I have a wife and children." The question itself contained its own answer. Against an enemy possessing unlimited resources, unwavering determination, and a proven ability to recover from any setback, continued resistance had become utterly futile. By the spring of 1945, German soldiers were surrendering in unprecedented numbers. Over 317,000 were captured in the Ruhr pocket alone, a number twice what American intelligence had initially estimated. Many actively sought out American units to surrender to, explicitly preferring American captivity to falling into Soviet hands. The Ruhr pocket became the death knell of the Wehrmacht in the West. American and British forces had completely encircled Germany's industrial heartland, trapping nearly 350,000 Axis troops. Day after day, American loudspeakers broadcast surrender appeals. Day after day, the pocket relentlessly shrank as German units ran out of food, ammunition, and all hope. German soldiers made these critical decisions based on what they had learned about their enemy. Those on the Eastern Front understood precisely what capture by the Soviets entailed. The atrocities committed by German forces in Russia were now being repaid with brutal interest. But capture by Americans was distinctly different. Word had spread through the Wehrmacht that Americans treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, that they provided food and medical care, and that they did not execute surrendering soldiers. This vital knowledge profoundly shaped German behavior as the Reich collapsed. Units fought desperately to escape westward, specifically so they could surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. Soldiers discarded their weapons and walked toward American lines with hands raised. Officers negotiated surrenders for entire divisions. The contrast with the Eastern Front could not have been more stark. Against the Soviets, German soldiers fought with the desperation of men who knew capture meant certain death or the Gulag. Against the Americans, surrender had become a rational choice.